right, that have to be perceived by receptors. There is specificity for these. Specific stimuli need specific receptors. The only way you know if something is happening is if you have a receptor that can perceive that stimuli. Are there stimuli in our environment that you can't perceive? Absolutely, right? We don't have the ability to perceive electromagnetic fields. Are there organisms that do? Sure, and they use it to help orient themselves and use direction and things like that. But we don't have receptors for that, right? So anything that our body can either recognize in our external environment or our internal environment, we have to have receptors specific for that. Right? Once a receptor recognizes a stimulus, this is a chemoreceptor, then we would have that kind of, this would be a protein-ligand kind of interaction. This could be a photoreceptor in the retina of the eye. This could be thermoreceptors in the skin. These could be stretch receptors in tendons. They could be pressure receptors in arteries. It just varies, right, depending upon what we're doing. But they recognize certain stimuli. Once this stimulus is strong enough to trigger a response or to fire the receptor, if you will, a signal would be sent along a sensory pathway to the central nervous system. And this signal, when we say a signal is sent along a sensory afferent pathway, what that signal is something called an action potential. Okay. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Once that information gets to the central nervous system, there is integration. If the integration is very rapid and simple and crude, that usually is because it's happening at the spinal cord and we need it to happen very quickly. We don't think, right? If there needs to be further interpretation, we have to associate this stimulus with past experiences or things like that. That involves a particular neural pathway in the brain. Right? And that takes longer time, but it's still integration within the central nervous system. The level of the brain, multiple neurons instead of just a few neurons in the pathway. Once the integration occurs, essentially what the central nervous system is deciding, if you will, is this stimulus strong enough to elicit a response? If the answer is no, the stimulus seems okay, nothing happens. The story stops here. But if this stimulus, the information perceived is that we're out of homeostasis with whatever this stimulus is, then the central nervous system needs to give a response. And the response then comes out of motor efferent pathway. If we are controlling skeletal muscles, this would be somatic motor. If we are controlling, involuntary, right? If we are controlling autonomic things, right, like smooth muscle glands and whatever, this would be part of the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic or parasympathetic would go to an effector. Effectors are muscles or glands. They're things that do things, right? Muscles contract and allow for movement of either the body or things within some hollow body, right? Or they're glands, exocrine or endocrine, and we secrete something. And that cell's action gives you the response. Now, classically, it's negative feedback, right? If something was too high, the response is to bring it back down. If something was too low, the response is to bring it back up. But it could be, there are a couple classic, transient examples of positive feedback where the response is to enhance or depress whatever the original stimulus was. But this is our big picture. Okay? Now, from the standpoint of a neuron, the same basic kind of information happens. Right? If you look at our classic example of a neuron, like I don't want to review all the different kinds of neurons, right? But there's unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, right? As far as structure, 99.9% of all neurons are multipolar. They look like this. That's because 99.9% of all neurons are in the brain. Interneurons or association neurons, and they're 100% multipolar. So are motor neurons, right? Sensory neurons, on the other hand, could be unipolar or bipolar. But here we have that same kind of flow of information here. So within a neuron, there is also an afferent pathway, an integration, an efferent pathway, and a response. Okay? And the information flow is like this, right? What are all of these structures out here called? Dendrites, right? They receive information. Okay? So they are kind of the afferent equivalents, right? They are bringing information to the cell body of the neuron. And then this is the cell body of the neuron here. And through here. And it's in the cell body where this information that's coming in is integrated. Meaning, this information that the dendrites are receiving, is it strong enough, right, like this, to elicit a response by that neuron? And what I'm saying really is that stimulus strong enough for that neuron to release a neurotransmitter at the very end of the axon? Right? If the answer is no, nothing happens. If yes, then we need to send a signal all the way down this long axon to the axon terminal where they will release a neurotransmitter. That's the response, the release of the neurotransmitter. But this cell body needs to figure out, so to speak, whether or not this signal is strong enough. And the region of the neuron where this integration occurs is right there. It's that area called the hillock. It's just this rise. A hillock means small hill, right? So it's this area where there looks like there's a little hill coming out that the axon leaves. Okay? And it is at that axon hillock where integration occurs. Okay? So this is where the neuron decides if that information the neuron, at the neuron level, is receiving is worth sending a signal. And if it is, then what happens is that signal gets sent all the way down this axon, right? All the way to the terminals. And once we reach the terminals, right here, that will trigger the release of the neurotransmitter. Now, what the neurotransmitter is depends upon what neuron this is. If this was a parasympathetic autonomic neuron releasing a neurotransmitter on smooth muscle, the neurotransmitter would be acetylcholine. If this was a sympathetic neuron releasing something on a gland, it would be norepinephrine. It depends on where we are, right? And we'll see, one of the things we're going to do a little bit later is talk about the autonomic nervous